What's the first thing you think about when someone mentions the Space Shuttle program? You might think of the white and black orbiter that took humans and payload to space. Or you might remember a more tragic event when Challenger exploded just 73 seconds after liftoff in 1986. If your first thought was of the American space program, you cannot be blamed. But did you know the Soviet Union also developed a space shuttle program? The name might have been different, and the technology might have been more advanced than what the Americans were working with. But the short-lived Soviet shuttle program became the perfect example of what taking the blueprints and developing an astonishing space beast look like. You're watching The Dig, and this is the story of the Soviet shuttle, the Energia-Buran. Following the historic moon landing of Apollo 11 in July of 1969, Americans had officially won the space race, and both Cold War rivals began looking at the future of their space ventures. NASA went on to land 6 more crews on the moon, and the Soviets continued flying missions as part of their Soyuz program. A fun fact to mention is that the Soyuz program is the most longevous manned space program in history, thanks to the fact that it's still in operation today. But back to history now. So, the Apollo program ends in 1972, and NASA is already busy working on a brand new space program that'll see Americans use a reusable vehicle and allow the agency to fly it as often as once a week to keep up with the ever-growing demand of flying military and civilian payload to low Earth orbit. This revolutionary program was to be called the Space Shuttle, and it would become the most complicated vehicle ever built. The development continued throughout the 1970s, and the first flight, the STS-1, would take off on April 12, 1981, exactly 20 years after Yuri Gagarin's historic first spaceflight. When President Richard Nixon announced the program in early January of 1972, the Soviets had one pressing issue on their mind. What would the Americans use their shuttle for? Their biggest concern was the fear that the American shuttle would be used for espionage purposes and intelligence gathering. Even more dramatic, Soviet leadership was fearing the Americans might even use the shuttle for military purposes to conduct quote-unquote orbital bombardments. So, just 4 years later, in 1976, the Soviet government began working on their own shuttle that would take the best aspects of the American shuttle and make it even better. Named Buran, meaning snowstorm or blizzard in Russian, the program technically existed in theory since the 1950s, when the Soviet government began thinking of implementing a reusable space vehicle that would be refurbished after each use and prepared for the next flight in no time. It wasn't until the Americans created their shuttle that the Soviets soon followed along, and the similarities between the two programs and vehicles were more than obvious. According to Roland White, author of the 2016 book Into the Black, the extraordinary untold story of the first flight of the Space Shuttle Columbia and the astronauts who flew her, the similarities between the two shuttles were likely due to the fact that Soviet leadership had both used the publicly available documents released during the production of the American shuttle, and thanks to the Soviet espionage efforts that went on all throughout the 1970s. The appearance of the two orbiters, the black and white airplane-looking vehicle that carried astronauts and payload to space, is eerily similar. Still, the Soviet shuttle was far more advanced in more than one way in comparison to its American counterpart. First and foremost, we need to explain the difference between the American and Soviet shuttle stack. Starting with the American, the space shuttle was made of 3 primary components: the orbiter, the giant orange external tank filled with liquid oxygen and hydrogen that helped propel the shuttle to low Earth orbit, and the two tall solid rocket boosters, SRBs, that used solid fuel to allow for liftoff to even take place. The Soviet stack, on the other hand, consisted of the orbiter, the enormous Energia rocket, and the four Zenit-derived strap-on boosters. Firstly, the Soviet shuttle's main engines weren't part of the orbiter, as was the case with the American shuttle. Instead, they attached to the Energia rocket that helped propel the Soviet orbiter into space. Once in low Earth orbit, the cosmonauts could maneuver the orbiter's direction and perform the deorbit burn thanks to smaller rocket engines attached to the orbiter, similar to the American shuttle's OMS, Orbital Maneuvering System, engines. Secondly, the Soviet shuttle was designed to also fly without the crew on board by using autopilot. This was one of the most revolutionary aspects of the Soviet shuttle, as its American counterpart could only fly with a commander and pilot on board. So, when the Soviet shuttle flew for the first time in November of 1988 with no cosmonauts aboard, Americans knew the Soviet shuttle wasn't only technologically more advanced than their own, but also far safer for their cosmonauts. Among the biggest differences between the two is the fact that the Soviet shuttle used liquid-fueled booster rockets. See, the solid rocket boosters used by NASA were considered as the most dangerous aspect of the entire shuttle stack. Considering they couldn't be turned off once they were on, if they ignited, a launch would proceed no matter what. In fact, it was a faulty O-ring on one of the SRBs, due to freezing temperatures on the morning of the launch, that caused the Challenger disaster in late January of 1986. Therefore, the Soviet liquid-fueled boosters were far safer and more manageable, allowing for a cutoff of their engines if something went wrong. So, although the two shuttles looked similar, they were very different. But why is this fascinating part of Soviet space history nowadays mostly forgotten? Well, it goes without saying that the late 1980s in the Soviet Union were everything but prosperous and calm. Although Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to modernize and revitalize a country so desperate for independence and freedom by implementing perestroika and glasnost, constitutional changes in Poland and Hungary inspired the people of the Soviet Union to look towards a different future, especially one that didn't involve the Soviet Union itself anymore. By November 15, 1988, when the first flight of the Energia-Buran took place from Baikonur Cosmodrome, the Soviet Union was hanging on by a thread. Although Gorbachev's reforms were politically changing the communist stronghold, the economic crisis kept increasing. For this precise reason, the first and only flight of the Energia-Buran was a major sign that the once mighty Soviet Union buckled under the pressure of economic troubles and nationalist movements that slowly but surely took the USSR by storm. Although the first flight of the mighty new space program went remarkably well, showcasing the ingenuity of the Soviet Space Agency and the potential it could have, the rapid disintegration of the Soviet Union proved their shuttle program couldn't go on for much longer. Besides the fact that economic circumstances were heavily affecting the profitability and feasibility of a reusable space vehicle, following the dismantlement of the USSR in December of 1991, the Buran program simply, quote, had no civilian tasks left, and the military ones were no longer needed, end quote, according to Russian cosmonaut Oleg Kotov. The program was officially brought to a close in 1993. The story doesn't end here, though. For many urban explorers, the hangar that stored Soviet shuttles at the Baikonur Cosmodrome became a source of fascination and interest. Following the collapse of the hangar roof in May of 2002, that killed 8 workers and destroyed the iconic Buran orbiter that flew the first and only mission of the Soviet shuttle program, many began flocking to the site and exploring the rotting relics of a nearly forgotten period of Soviet history. Although there have been many attempts to limit the entry of urban explorers to the site, many continue sneaking in and taking fascinating photographs of the abandoned shuttles. Though the space race ended in favor of the Americans, the Soviets continued showcasing their technological prowess and capabilities throughout the 1970s and 1980s, culminating with an extraordinarily ambitious space program that suspiciously resembled that of their American counterpart. Although far safer, technologically more advanced, and strategically useful for military espionage and to build a steady space presence, the Soviet shuttle program ultimately ended before it even began, plagued by the most tumultuous time in Soviet history that saw the disintegration of the entire Union just 3 years following Buran's first flight. Today, just a footnote in the history of Soviet space ventures, the Buran program remains an example of a program that became a victim of unfavorable political and economic conditions, and a country that dominated space exploration up until NASA put men on the moon. If the Soviet Union never collapsed, or at least if it didn't collapse when it did, there's good reason to believe the Buran program would have become the shining new star of the Soviet Space Agency. Unfortunately, that can nowadays only remain a point of discussion. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more niche and uncharted history topics that are yet to be covered. Until next time, diggers.